Please watch the video until the end to hear the full accounting of what happened in Sector Delta. Every minute matters. Chapter 1: The day they hung the curtains. When the ship stalled above the river, no one asked whether they would leave. We thought they were monuments, hovering caskets that would drift away when politicians ran out of photographs. They did not leave. They descended slow and oil-black, tethered like dying whales above the industrial docks. People gathered on rooftops and called it a visitation. The first week smelled like burnt plastic and fear. The second week smelled like ash. They called the place Sector Delta to make it official. That name sat like a stamp. Municipal manageable. We drew lines on our maps and tape on our doors. I worked as a records analyst for a private relocation firm. We were the people sent in to make the indecent tidy. For pay, you walk through someone else's disaster and number the pieces that remain. I thought of it as a job, a ledger of displacement. I would not learn the truth until my ledger stained. Chapter 2: The children behind the fence. They lived in the empty grain silos and beneath the overpasses, in a maze of canvas and corrugated iron. People whispered that the newcomers were gods or monsters depending on who you asked and how itchy their conscience. I met them through a translator rig we were issued. A slab of plastic with a sputtering speaker. The first voice that came through it was not a voice at all but harmonics that made your teeth ache. Human interpreters called them the guests to pretend we had compassion. Children ran with lanyards of metal chips and made toys from rust. They taught themselves to mimic our laughter and our curses. At night, the camp was lit by blue flames, small stoves that pulsed with a cold light. I remember one boy, thin as wire, offering me a scrap of tinfoil and a smile that was almost human. I took the tinfoil, and he pressed it into my palm as if giving me a bone. We had orders to mark every structure, every family name, prepare the lists for relocation. We stamped boxes with temporary housing, and relinquished belongings. Bureaucracy was our catechism. We spoke of quotas and compliance while bodies shuffled in the background, while someone was always asking for water, and someone else always needing papers. Chapter 3: The vanishing of light. The company that oversaw our contracts, Concord Security, wore smiles like helmets. They brought armored vans and promises. They offered upgrades and voluntary relocation packages, dinners, job fairs, while night vans hauled away the quiet ones and never returned them to any registry. Concord had lab coats as well as guns. Science and violence braided themselves into one program. They told us it was for safety. We told ourselves it was for order. I remember the first person to disappear. She had been living in a pickup with 3 others, and one night men in black came and counted heads against their manifest. The next morning the truck was parked where it always had been, but there was an empty space under the blanket where she used to sleep. A neighbor said she'd been taken for processing. You could see the way his hands curled. Small animal claws of someone protecting their distance from what they had seen. There were experiments. There were devices that hummed in makeshift labs in the warehouses. Concord called them medical extractions. The camp called them the boxes. People refused to look. The ones who did come back were different. Their hair thin to pale threads. Their eyes remembered no home. They avoided sunlight as if it burned them. Chapter 4: Infection or mercy or both. My change was a slow theft. It began with a bruise no one could remember earning. A stain of silver blue under my skin that spread like spilled ink. Then came the noises inside my mouth, as though another throat had learned to speak. I blamed a fever, then blamed bad chow, then blamed myself for working too close to the laboratories. Concord's doctors wrote me up for contagious exposure, and kept me in a room where instruments clicked like teeth. They told me the guest's blood contained technology, or perhaps technology was a language and their blood its grammar. They promised remedies if I agreed to cooperate, to relinquish what I knew. Cooperation was an umbrella for silence. I found later that the difference between cure and experiment was whether consent came in pencil or blood. The changes were not dramatic at first. I felt taller at the edges, the world sliding an inch farther from my hands. My skin found patterns, lines that glowed faintly when I was alone. At night, something in the camp hummed a reply. I thought I was going mad. I later learned there was no later for many others. They became vessels and maps for a machine learning to read our language of suffering. Chapter 5: When the machines broke. Machines do not always obey. There was a night when the alarm sounded different. a low, keening pitch like a celestial animal trapped beneath the city. Concorde's van stalled in the mud. Lights went out and the fabric of their order frayed. The guests took advantage of this cleaving. They whispered instructions in harmonics and the machines answered, not with language but with motions. Ramps moved, doors opened, and the old promises of flight sputtered back to life. We tried to leave. Concorde tightened its nets. People fought in the alleys, lit fires to keep warm and to waste the oxygen of the air. I carried a boy on my shoulders who smelled of sea metal and lemon. His name was Yarrow. He kept asking me where his mother had gone. I had no answer. I had a ledger. When the largest ship came down to touch the ground, it did not lift. It had been disabled, and above its belly the sky was a smear of smoke. People screamed prayers to gods who had left them first. Concorde's men set up a ring of fire and called it containment. They called me to sign off on the lists as if my signature could stave off howling. Chapter 6: The Cost of Keeping a Story. This is the part of the confession no official would print. When the power failed, and Concorde's men walked out with their heads lowered like men leaving church after a funeral, some of us went into the warehouses. There we found chambers with walls that pulsed. They had not been built for us. They had been built by the guests, or for them, or as something between. In one chamber we found a machine that hummed the cadence of memory. When you stood too close you felt pictures. Faces, ships, a planet that smelled of salt. I kissed that machine because I wanted to know how to call a mother by the sound of her name. I kissed it and it kissed back in the way machines do, by rearranging molecules, by offering a trade. A thing for a thing. I left Sector Delta with my body stained and my notepad full of names. Concorde made sure many of them were erased from public records. I was lucky my infection slowed. I could still pass as human if I kept my hands in my pockets and my face measured in appliances. But I am not the same. At night, when the city sleeps and the glow of the street lamps throws long, honest shadows, my skin remembers the blue light and the voices that ask me to bring them home. I write this because memory is an act of shelter. To tell is to shelter someone else from repeating the same exact blind cruelty. I have watched governments rename horrors to fit their budgets. I have watched corporations turn people into liabilities. I have learned that the neat lines we draw on maps are excuses to ignore the dirty stuff underfoot. If you think this was punishment for curiosity, you are wrong. The worst things that happened were not acts of vengeance by some alien intelligence. They were human decisions. We carved out a place to look away and called it order. We did worse. We traded our neighbors for less paperwork. I survived because I slipped through a back gate with a boy jammed into the crook of my arm, and a satchel of stolen instruments.